Okay, we got a lot to talk about this week because we're on everyone's favorite topic, MMA judges. And of course, this week that was sparked by the Holm and Vierra fight. A lot of people thought that was an atrocious decision. Other people not so much. They think it was close and it was a coin toss. Nonetheless, though, when these decisions come in, everyone talks about the judges and scoring and criteria for the next week. So that's what we're going to do. And what we're going to do is we're going to touch on all the people that have been talking about it. We're going to go over the 2 cents that they threw in and see what we think about it. And then we're going to go over the rule sets and criteria for the two most prominent rule sets in MMA and ultimately loop this all together with some recommendations for fighters because whatever the root problem is with judging and criteria right now, it's not going to be an overnight fix. So, what can they do in the meantime to reduce their own chances of getting screwed in a decision, right? So, let's jump in. People we heard from this week that I thought were noteworthy: Chael Sonnen, as usual. He always throws his 2 cents in on these things. Michaeel Bisping, Big John McCarthy, Shannon Knapp, who's the Invicta founder and president, and Andy Foster, who is the executive director of the California Athletic State Commission. Let's start at the top with Chael. So, Chael got hung up on this topic a bit because apparently after this fight now, because of the controversy, there's going to be some meeting between MMA broadcasters, announcers like Chael, DC, Joe Rogan, these people, and the judges to help get them on the same page. Sounds good, sounds useful on the surface. Chael thinks it's stupid though, because we're basically playing a game of telephone. And it kind of makes sense because the judges are just also getting handed, training of course, but they're getting handed a rule book, being asked to interpret that and then enforce it. No different than us. So he thinks that meeting, first of all, he thinks it shouldn't even really take place. There's not really value there. But if it does, it should be with the executive director who tells us what the interpretation of those rules are. And then we all go from there with the same idea rather than, letting that interpretation get changed over time from meeting to meeting. And like I said earlier, playing a game of telephone. He thinks what we really need, instead of, meetings like that or hounding judges, whatever it may be, he thinks what we really need is a review system. So, if there's a fight that is blatantly scored wrong, for example, Volkanovski Holloway 2. I'm a big Volkanovski fan, but that decision was just, I don't know. I don't know how. Dana White even said at the press conference after that fight, he asked all the media, did anybody score that for Volkanovski? That was an atrocious decision. So, some way for them to be held accountable, maybe a way to overturn the fight in a review situation. That's what Chael thinks is necessary. I don't completely disagree. I think that would be useful. I don't know how they would go about implementing that with all the different, like, would each state have to have their own review system? Probably, because each state has their own commission. But that sounds like something that would be very beneficial for fighters, because they know there's at least a second look if something looks to be just blatantly wrong. The last point he touched on was how a lot of people don't understand the 10-9 must system. And I'm glad he touched on that because we're going to circle back to that later in this video when we talk about all the rule sets. So keep that one in mind as we continue going down. Bisping is on the same page. Says there's got to be a way to keep the judges accountable. And what was so crazy about him going on this tangent is he told a story about how Coach John Wood brought some judges to his gym so that they could learn more about what to look for in fights and understand actually what's happening. And apparently, when they got to the grappling portion of whatever you want to call this, a seminar or just day to learn, apparently a bunch of them got up and left because they didn't understand it, don't know what they're looking at, so they literally left. Which shows you that they have no idea what they're judging when the grappling exchange begins. which will also be good, key to keep in mind as we circle back to the rule sets. There's a few things that are going to make a lot of sense, and it's how we're going to make some recommendations to the fighters, because it's important that they know how the people judging them and affecting their paycheck are thinking about the fight. So keep that story in mind there as well. John McCarthy, not too much to say on his take this week. Funny enough, because the reason I like going to him for things like this is because he wrote some of these damn rules. So I like to hear what he says. But just with respect to the Holm and Vierra fight, I thought one interesting point he mentioned is that the judges aren't giving enough credit for cage control. And what he means specifically is the grappling exchanges against the cage. How he explained it is that needs to be weighted the same as if I take you down and I'm able to keep you on the ground, I'm almost without a doubt going to win that round, right? That's how that's being looked at. It needs to be the same against the cage, is what he was saying. So if I can hold you against the cage, you cannot leave, you cannot get out just because I'm controlling it, that needs to be treated the same as a grappling exchange on the ground. I thought that was interesting, and I thought that particular point would explain what some people thought was a backwards decision with the Holm and Vierra fight, because clearly Holm's cage control was not valued enough. So wanted to touch on that. But the more interesting topics, I think, are from Shannon Knapp and Andy Foster. We'll start with Shannon Knapp. The reason it was interesting to hear from her on Ariel Helwani's MMA Hour this week is because, like I mentioned at the beginning, she's the Invicta founder and president. But they're one of the few organizations that has open scoring. And a lot of people think that open scoring is the solution to this judging problem. You know, the fighters get to see where they're at, and whether the judges are right, wrong, or somewhere in between, they know what the fighters know what they have to do going into the last round or whatever, because they know I'm up 2, I'm down 2, and they can go for it if they have to, right? So, how has that been working for Invicta? She said that they have had nothing but positive comments on open scoring. She's probably super biased since she's the president, and I also don't know how long they've been doing it. Like, what's their sample size? I'm not sure. They do open scoring. Have they been doing it for 2 years and 20 events, or has this been like 3 events? I don't know. But apparently so far so good, so that's a good sign. Her philosophy behind why this is good is it gives the athletes, the fighters, more tools to control the outcome of their fight, which directly refers to what I said a couple seconds ago of they can look up, see the score, shit, I'm down 3 rounds and it's round 4. Gotta empty the tank. I like that. I think that philosophy is good. And just to shed some light on how it works at Invicta, the scores are given to coaches between rounds, and then the fighters can choose to know it or not. Obviously, they can tell their coaches, don't tell me, or do tell me. And then the score is only broadcasted on the big screen or on the broadcast to those watching once the next round has started. So that if a fighter doesn't want to see the score, they don't see it on the big screen while they're on the stool between rounds. That's why they do that. I don't know. I haven't been able to catch an Invicta event and actually see this in action, so I'm very curious now. So I'm going to look up when the next ones are and watch it for myself. But she also tried to address some of the main criticisms of open scoring, specifically people coasting if they're up 2 rounds to none going into the third, or up 4-0 going into the fifth in a 5-round fight. She says that doesn't happen because the other opponent is down 2 or down 4. So they're coming like a bat out of hell to empty the tank and try and win the fight. She says she has not seen that yet. But again, I'm just wondering, like, what's the sample size? How many events have they done this with? That's interesting. The other critique is that, and she didn't actually comment on this one, but the other critique is that you lose that surprise, that fun moment when the judge announces the winner for example, if you're watching a, but yeah, so if you're watching a close fight, especially if it's a title fight, you think, oh, it's 2-2 going into the fifth. It comes down to the fifth round. That surprise is part of the fun. But if it's a close fight and it's 2-2 and the scores are open, they're not going to show the score of the fifth round until the judge, reveals the winner. So that's not necessarily the biggest problem. But she didn't touch on that. So I don't know if they've fixed that, found a way around it, running into that problem. Who knows? But that's a great segue into what Andy Foster talked about, because these are the two reasons he's not in favor of open scoring. He says you'll lose the last round. He says he's seen it time and time again, especially in boxing. If you're up 2-0 or 4-0, you coast. You skirt around the outside of the cage, or at the very least, you don't take unnecessary risks and go for broke. And then he says you lose the end of the fight surprise, the and still or the and new. That one, Ariel Helwani made a good point, is what I just said, is if it's 2-2, you still get it in a close fight. A blowout is a blowout. So even if you have an open scoring that says, red corner's up 4-zip, if that fight's that much of a blowout, you're probably able to put that together for yourself as you're watching. So it might not be a surprise anyways when they announce it. It's only a surprise when they get it wrong, which open scoring would show us is happening in real time. So we'd, in theory, have fighters going crazy in those last rounds trying to do something. But as you can see, that doesn't solve people judging fights incorrectly. It just gives the fighters a chance to go wild and try and stop it from going to the judges. So yeah, when you go through it like that, it doesn't seem to be solving the root problem, whatever that is, which I'm not even sure we've identified yet. Now, Andy Foster did have some other suggestions, which I thought were interesting, is he thinks we need to use the yellow card more. And the yellow card is used over in Asia in one championship. But over here in North America, it's actually called the timidity foul. And the timidity foul is defined as any fighter who purposely avoids contact with his or her opponent or runs away from the action of the fight. It can also be called by the referee for any attempt by a fighter to receive time by falsely claiming foul injury or purposely dropping or spitting out their mouthpiece. And the reason he says we need to use this more is we need to give the judges something to judge. If I interpreted this correctly, he's saying that a lot of these controversial decisions or tough decisions are because nothing's happening in the fight. So you need to penalize them, give them something to judge so it's a bit more clear, right? I think the timidity foul would have been super useful in the Rose and Carla fight. I don't know why they wouldn't use it. I agree with him there. But the question I have with this foul is, let's just quickly go back to the definition here. Defined as any fighter who purposely avoids contact. That's the part I want to hone in on, right? Because I think the timidity foul could arguably apply to more than that. So avoiding contact implies that we're on the feet and I'm simply just evading, running away, basically. But could it also be applied to someone who's just holding? Andy Foster called this the wet blanket effect. So if I take you down and just lie there, I'm not doing any damage, I'm not letting you get up and go anywhere, I'm effectively stalling. Do we apply the timidity foul there? I know Joe Rogan is extremely against that. He thinks if you're able to hold someone down, you should be able to hold someone down. And if you don't want to be held down, get up. And I partially agree with that. But this is also a sport. It's a televised entertainment business. So I wonder if that timidity foul definition needs updating. But whether it does or not, I do agree with him that we should apply that more. We should not be seeing fights like Rose and Carla, or Francis and Derek Lewis, or Adesanya and Romero. I think we should be using that more. I see them use the yellow card in one championship, and the yellow card also takes away 10% of their purse. I don't know if the timidity foul does the same or if it just takes away points. That's not clear here in the definition. But hey, if it takes away points, that contributes to you losing the fight, which means you could lose your win bonus. So in a sense, it indirectly affects the income. So whether or not you need to take 10% with each timidity foul, I don't know if that really matters. But I like this suggestion. So now that we've made our way into fouls and rules, let's take a look at the two most common rule sets that we have in MMA, which is the unified rules, which is what we all know over here in North America, UFC, Bellator, whatnot, and then the global rule set, which they use in one championship. Reason I thought this would be great to talk about is because, first of all, we can get a better understanding of what the judges are looking at, how are they being told to judge these fights, but also, could the global rule set be a partial solution to this problem? So you'll see why. The unified rules is the 10-9 must system that we all know. So each round has to be scored at the end of the round. So you have to choose a winner of that round. What that means is that if you have a 3-round fight or a 5-round fight, effectively you have 5 mini fights. You have 5 fights, and it's best of 5 is what that is. That's what that means. And a lot of fighters forget this. And that's circling back to Chael saying people don't understand the 10-9. What he meant by that is, if we have a 5-round fight, and I beat the absolute hell out of my opponent in round 1, but then they narrowly edge me out in rounds 2, 3, 4, and 5. They won 4 rounds out of 5. Even though it looks like I beat, like if they look physically more damaged, they won more of the rounds. They won 4 mini fights. I won 1. And fighters think that the example he uses GSP versus Hendricks. GSP took a lot of damage, but it was predominantly in a specific round, for example. The other one, it was another GSP example. It was the first GSP BJ Penn fight. BJ Penn put it on him in round 1. GSP edged him out in 2 and 3. So, and I think the fighters forget this, is that each round is judged individually. Every time you start a new round, consider that 0-0. Right? That's what the 10-9 must system is. The global rule set, and I think sometimes fighters in their mind think that they need to be evaluated like this, is the fight is judged as a whole. Right? So there is no scorecards going in after each round. There's one scorecard for the entirety of the fight at the end of the fight. So, along with that, there's also different scoring criteria. So let's look at the global rule set. This is what they're judging on. In this order, near KO or near submission is the number one thing that they judge in the global rule set. This is what they use in one championship. So if you knock someone down or very obviously rock them in the first, for example, 20 seconds of a fight, that's the number one scoring criteria they have. Number 2 is damage. So if you do a lot of damage to someone, in a span of a couple minutes, but then they dominate in a 15-minute fight, 3 rounds, they dominate the next 13 minutes or so, you'll still win because you did more damage. Doesn't matter that they were nearly outpointing you in a sense for rounds 2 and 3 and the other half of round 1. Then 3rd is striking superiority and ground control. 4 is takedown and takedown defense. 5 is aggression. Those are the criteria in order. And to see this in action and what it really means and how heavily they weigh the top one, I suggest watching the Eddie Alvarez versus Ok-Ray Yun fight from last year, April 28th, 2021. Alvarez lost because he got rocked right away in the first round. I think it was 1 or 2 minutes in. Rocked, and then his opponent jumps on him with the flurries. He survives, gets back up, fights out the round, but then clearly wins the next 2 rounds, the way we judge it on a 10-9 must. But that near KO or that damage is valued so heavily that it doesn't matter that Eddie Alvarez technically won, 12 minutes of that fight. That's how heavily they value near KO, near submission, and damage. Okay, let's keep that in mind. We move over to the unified rules. This is what we have in North America. And the prioritized criteria here is effective striking and grappling. That's 1. Effective aggressiveness. That's 2. And fight area control. And what's very important to know here is that the bottom 2, effective aggressiveness and fight area control, those don't even come into effect if you can judge the round based on the first one, right? And then the third one does not come into effect if you can judge it on the second one. So it's not like these all have different weights, for example. So it's not 60% of effective striking and grappling, 20% of the other two. It's 100% of the first one unless it is equal. And the definition of effective striking and grappling is legal blows that have immediate or cumulative impact with the potential to contribute towards the end of the match, with the immediate weighing more heavily than the cumulative impact. That means, in theory, if someone is landing more shots on me, so the cumulative impact is slowly building, but I just land a bomb and drop them, that should be weighed more heavily than their cumulative impact. So assuming that was a round that was all striking, I should win that round. Continuing through the definition, successful execution of takedowns, submission attempts, reversals, and the achievement of advantageous positions that produce immediate or cumulative impact with the potential to contribute to the end of the match, and again with the immediate weighing more heavily than the cumulative impact. It shall be noted that successful takedown is not merely a changing of position, but the establishment of an attack from the use of the takedown. Very important. So when we see takedowns and nothing happens, or they jump back up, that's basically worth 0. Right? Important to know that if you're a fighter. You have to establish the position and establish some kind of attack for that to be worth anything. Continuing through this definition, top and bottom position fighters are assessed more on the impactful, effective results of their actions, more so than their position. Keep that in mind, because that's simply not true, and I'll show you why. That's how it should be judged. That's what the definition is. But these rules actually contradict themselves a little bit, and if you watch enough fights, you can see that they don't treat that the same. If you're on top, you're winning the round. That's what you should think. But let's finish this definition. This criterion will be the deciding factor in a high majority of the decisions when scoring a round. The next 2 criteria must be treated as backup and used only when the effective striking grappling is 100% equal. Right? So this explains how we got to Carla Esparza decision in that fight, because it was striking grappling based on this definition 100% equal. They basically did nothing. Effective aggressiveness. Let's read this definition. Aggressively making attempts to finish the fight. The key term is effective. Chasing after an opponent with no effect, result, or impact should not render the judge's assessments. Effective aggressiveness is only to be assessed if effective striking grappling is 100% equal, right? So let's think about Rose and Carla again. Carla was going forward, but nothing was effective, right? Because Rose was just skirting around, so she couldn't do anything effective. So this is how that fight got to this third criterion, the third and final one, fight area control. Fighting area control is assessed by determining who is dictating the pace, place, and position of the match. Fighting area control shall only be assessed if effective striking and grappling and effective aggressiveness is 100% equal for both competitors. This will be assessed very rarely. Well, in that fight it was, and basically, if it ever gets to this criterion, in my humble opinion, you can safely assume the fighter walking forwards is going to take the round. That's how we got and knew Carlos Esparza. Now, remember up here in the effective striking and grappling where they said that position is not of as much concern, rather the actions of the fighters? That's not true. When we scroll down to the definition of a 10-8 round, now I'm not going to go into 10-9s, 10-8s, 10-7s, but what I noticed in here, in this definition, is this sentence: MMA is an offensive-based sport. No scoring is given for defensive maneuvers. So, now the judges should be a trained eye, but we clearly know that they're not as trained of an eye as we can see. Being on your back looks defensive. Walking backward looks defensive. And fighters need to understand that. So, what is the takeaway from all this? If you're a fighter, what can you do to, improve your chances of not getting screwed by the judges? Because this problem that we're talking about with judging, scoring, criteria, it sounds in there, I just showed you, it sounds like the rules sometimes even contradict themselves. So this isn't going to be an overnight fix, but fighters have fights coming, they have careers. Some of them might be done by the time this is improved. Some of them are at least going to have several fights before it's improved, so you want their best chance of winning that. What I would say is they need to understand the game they're playing, right? Read the rules like I just did, and watch fights to get an idea of the average way that judges call fights. Basically, going over these rules, what I can tell, if you're throwing the most volume with the intent to injure, going forward, and, for example, could secure a takedown and land some strikes, you'll win a round if you can achieve these three things. Where the mistake happens with fighters is they don't realize that even though this is a fight and they're doing something that's like, what we've done is taken our barbaric thing, like a street fight, and we've turned it into a sport. And they're forgetting about the sport part, right? We've gamified this, and you have to gamify the rules. You have to understand who's judging, how they're judging, and if you can't go out there and just, put it on a person and get them out of there in 2 rounds, you need to have some kind of strategy, right? And you have to understand how what you're doing looks to someone else from the outside looking in, which is always the judges. They see you going backwards. That just looks like a defensive maneuver. You might say, oh, but I'm controlling where we are. I'm using my footwork. I'm making them come to me. The judges aren't that smart. The viewers aren't that smart. What they see is you're going backwards. The other person's coming forwards. You look scared. And that's how it will be judged. For jiu-jitsu people, I see this mistake all the time. They get taken down and they're happy to stay on their back and play jiu-jitsu because they think, oh, I can submit from the bottom. But then, because this is MMA, you're allowed to punch, you're allowed to throw elbows and things like that. Submitting from the bottom is hard in jiu-jitsu by itself, let alone when someone can throw punches at you. So then a whole round goes by and you're on your back. That looks defensive. You lose the round. Right? The fighters need to take these things into account and understand, even though they might be more offensive from the bottom, you can do more damage from the bottom. Like if you're a Tony Ferguson, you drop elbows and things like that. But the judges don't get it. And they're not going to get it overnight. So understand the game you're playing, understand the rules, and something that could be very useful is Andy Foster. He hosts monthly Zoom meetings that anybody can join. And I would recommend, if you're a fighter, get your corners to show up. to go to that meeting and hear how the rules are interpreted by the commission and how they're judging fights. Because sometimes what they'll do in those Zoom meetings is they'll go over a fight and they'll go over why it was scored this way or that way. It's just, we've seen this too many times for fighters to not understand what's going on. They not understand the game they're playing. So hope that helped. Hope that shed some light on how these fights are being scored. I hope that anyone who fights heard this can make some adjustments to their game and not be blindsided by a decision when they think, oh, I was on the bottom playing jiu-jitsu for 3 rounds and I did more damage and I threw up some submission attempts and I lost. Why? It's because the judges look at things through a simple lens. So you got to make it simple and obvious that you're winning. I'm hitting them more than I'm getting hit. I'm pushing them backwards or I'm taking them down. All easier said than done. But if you do those things, it makes it easy for the judges to give you a decision if it goes that far. Other than that, that's all I got for today. Let me know what you think. Did you think that the Holm fight was scored incorrectly? What do you think about the global rule set versus unified rules? What do you think about open scoring? Do you think we should try it? And what do you think the fighter should do in the meantime? Because, like I said, this isn't going to be fixed overnight. I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts. Leave it in the comments. Let me know if you disagree with me. And I'll see you next week for more fights since we had a week off the UFC this week. So looking forward to doing some more breakdowns next week. Take care.